Especially with something like Deep Purple in rock, I thought was warranted. Child in Time, and there's a few other tracks on there, Highway Star.
When you think about the history of rock guitar, it's impossible not to think about Ritchie Blackmore. He wasn't the kind of musician who craved constant attention or tried to win everyone over with flashy performances. Instead, he operated in a different space entirely, one filled with minor keys and darker, more medieval sounds. While many of his contemporaries were busy chasing fame and writing songs designed for massive stadiums, Blackmore was quietly constructing something altogether different. His approach was rooted in precision and discipline, and that commitment to excellence transformed the landscape of hard rock music. Through his work with Deep Purple and later with Rainbow, Blackmore established himself as someone who could completely reimagine what rock guitar could sound like. But his distinctive style didn't just appear overnight. It was the result of careful study, deep listening, and a willingness to absorb influences from unexpected places. He took what he learned from various sources and twisted those lessons into something entirely new, creating sounds that no one had encountered before. His approach combined classical training with raw electric power, bringing together discipline and chaos in ways that gave hard rock its sharp, cutting edge. There were 7 albums in particular that served as blueprints for Blackmore's musical development. These weren't just records he happened to enjoy, they were teaching tools, each one showing him different possibilities. Some taught him when and how to break the rules. Others showed him which rules were worth keeping. From the explosive energy of Jimi Hendrix to the mathematical precision of Johann Sebastian Bach, each album left its mark on how Blackmore approached the guitar. He was never someone who followed trends or tried to copy what was popular at the moment. Instead, he created trends, and these 7 albums showed him how to do it. The first album that had a profound impact on Blackmore was Jimi Hendrix's debut, Are You Experienced?, which came out in 1967. There's really no overstating how much Hendrix changed everything about electric guitar. Before Hendrix, guitarists approached distortion as something to be avoided or minimized. After Hendrix, it became a tool, a way to create entirely new sounds. When Blackmore first heard this album, something clicked for him. He recognized that Hendrix was treating distortion not as a mistake or accident, but as an actual instrument in itself. Hendrix had found a way to make chaos sound completely intentional and purposeful. Blackmore later reflected on how Hendrix demonstrated that a guitar could scream and wail while still maintaining clear melodic lines. This was revolutionary for guitarists at the time. Songs like Purple Haze hit with the force of lightning, while Manic Depression spiraled through controlled madness. Hendrix wasn't simply playing notes on a fretboard. He was somehow bending reality itself through his instrument. For Blackmore, who had extensive classical training and a very disciplined approach to music, this was a crucial revelation. He saw that technique and wildness didn't have to be opposites. Structure and freedom could actually work together as partners rather than enemies. Hendrix famously played left-handed on a right-handed guitar that was strung backwards. He set his instruments on fire during performances and sometimes played with his teeth. But these weren't just circus tricks designed to draw attention. Behind every theatrical move was genuine precision and real skill. Blackmore respected that deeply. The showmanship served the music rather than serving Hendrix's ego. Blackmore never attempted to copy Hendrix directly because nobody really could, but he absorbed the fundamental lesson that electricity in rock music wasn't just about volume. It was about color, texture, and emotion being amplified through wood and wire. When Blackmore later crafted solos like the one in Highway Star or The Fury of Burn, Hendrix's influence was present not in the specific notes, but in the permission he had granted. Permission to let the guitar become something more than a traditional instrument, something dangerous and completely new. The second major influence came from the Yardbirds and their 1966 album, Roger the Engineer. The Yardbirds were essentially the blueprint that many bands tried to copy during that era. This album was released during Jeff Beck's time with the band, and the guitar work was simultaneously surgical and savage. Blackmore paid close attention to what they were doing. He noticed how the Yardbirds took American blues music and transformed it into something distinctly British, making it darker and stranger in the process. They didn't simply worship the blues tradition, they dissected it, analyzed it, and rebuilt it in their own image. Songs like Over, Under, Sideways, Down and Happenings 10 Years Ago Time demonstrated something vital to Blackmore. You could experiment with new sounds and approaches without losing the essential groove that made rock music work. You could be weird and unconventional without becoming pointless or self-indulgent. The Yardbirds managed to keep one foot planted in tradition while stretching the other foot far into the future. That balance fascinated Blackmore tremendously. The band wasn't afraid to incorporate feedback, distortion, or studio tricks into their music, but under all those experiments was real discipline and skill. The Yardbirds were also notable as a training ground for guitar legends. Eric Clapton had been there first, then Jeff Beck took over, and later Jimmy Page would complete this trinity of guitar gods. Three of the most influential guitarists in rock history emerged from a single band. That wasn't coincidence or luck, it was culture. The Yardbirds created an environment that demanded excellence while simultaneously encouraging risk-taking. Blackmore once observed that the Yardbirds proved you didn't need to choose between being a technically skilled musician and being an innovator. That idea stuck with him permanently. When Deep Purple formed just 2 years after this album's release, the DNA was obvious. Heavy riffs grounded in blues, solos that explored new territory without wandering aimlessly, structure that allowed for controlled chaos. The Yardbirds had built a bridge, and Blackmore was among the first to cross it with clear purpose and direction.
The third influential album was Cream's Disraeli Gears from 1967. This record proved that 3 musicians could create a sound bigger than an entire orchestra. Eric Clapton on guitar, Jack Bruce on bass, and Ginger Baker on drums filled every corner of the sonic space. When Blackmore heard this album, he understood something immediately. You didn't need more musicians in a band. You needed better musicians. The track Sunshine of Your Love became a blueprint for heavy rock. That riff was both simple and crushing, teaching Blackmore that real power comes from repetition, confidence, and leaving space in the music. Clapton wasn't attempting to play thousands of notes per minute. He was playing exactly the right notes, and that restraint created more impact than any flashy solo could. Other tracks like Strange Brew and Tales of Brave Ulysses added psychedelic colors without losing sight of the fundamental song structure. Each member of Cream was a virtuoso on their instrument, but they always served the song first, rather than showing off individual talents. Baker's drumming was influenced by jazz, but remained rock solid. Bruce's bass didn't just hold down the low end. It sang, argued, and sometimes led the music forward. Clapton's guitar cut through the mix without drowning out his bandmates. That balance was extremely rare in rock music. Blackmore later commented that Cream taught him empty space in music was just as important as the notes you chose to fill it with. He carried that lesson directly into Deep Purple. When you listen to Smoke on the Water, that famous riff breathes naturally. It doesn't rush or try to show off. It simply exists with total authority. That's Cream's influence working. 3 instruments locking together like gears in a precision machine, with every part essential and nothing wasted. Disraeli Gears proved that less could actually be infinitely more powerful than excess. The fourth influential album on Blackmore's list surprised many people. Nobody expected him to pick a Beatles album, but Blackmore never worried about what people expected from him. The Beatles' Revolver came out in 1966, and it marked a turning point where the band moved beyond screaming fans and simple pop songs. They were getting serious, getting experimental, and getting strange. Blackmore noticed and paid attention. The opening track, Tomorrow Never Knows, introduced sounds nobody had heard before in popular music. Tape loops, guitars played backwards, drums that somehow felt both ancient and futuristic at the same time. Taxman featured an angry riff that could have appeared on any hard rock record. Eleanor Rigby proved you didn't even need guitars to create something heartbreaking and powerful. The Beatles were clearly experimenting with new approaches, but they never forgot that the song itself had to work. That balance impressed Blackmore deeply. This album marked a significant turning point because the Beatles stopped touring that same year. They became essentially a studio band, using the recording process itself as a form of composition. For Blackmore, who would later spend countless hours perfecting guitar tones and arrangements in the studio, this approach validated something important. Perfectionism in service of art wasn't a weakness or self-indulgence. It was necessary. He observed that the Beatles demonstrated you could try absolutely anything in the studio, as long as the melody survived and the song remained strong. George Harrison's use of sitar on Love You Too, Paul McCartney's bass lines that moved and functioned like lead instruments, and the way the studio itself became part of the band's sound, all influenced Blackmore's thinking. When he later added keyboards and orchestration to Deep Purple and Rainbow recordings, that seed was planted by Revolver. The album taught him that musical boundaries were merely suggestions rather than laws, and the best musicians ignored them completely. The fifth influential album was Vanilla Fudge's self-titled debut from 1967. Sometimes the most effective way forward is to slow everything down dramatically. Vanilla Fudge understood this principle perfectly. Their album took familiar popular songs and made them completely unrecognizable, transforming them into something heavy, dramatic, and almost gothic in nature. Blackmore heard this approach and saw an entirely new possibility. You didn't have to write everything from scratch. You could take existing material and remake it completely in your own image. Their version of You Keep Me Hanging On was revolutionary. The Supremes' pop hit became a 7-minute funeral march. Organs swelled like cathedral walls. Drums pounded like a heartbeat slowly stopping. It was technically the same song, but it absolutely wasn't. It had become darker, heavier, and theatrical. Blackmore loved that transformation and that audacity. He later said that Vanilla Fudge gave him permission to be dramatic in his music without apologizing for it. That lesson echoed throughout his entire career. When Rainbow later covered rock songs and folk songs, adding medieval arrangements and epic scope, that Vanilla Fudge influence showing through. When Deep Purple stretched songs into 15-minute journeys that explored multiple themes and moods, that freedom originated here. Vanilla Fudge proved that reinvention wasn't theft or lack of creativity. It was actually an art form in itself. Take something known and familiar, make it strange and unsettling, make it yours, and make it completely unforgettable. The sixth album was Led Zeppelin's second record from 1969. Competition can push you to become better, and Led Zeppelin definitely threw down a challenge with this release. Led Zeppelin II wasn't just heavy music, it was a declaration of war in the battle for rock supremacy. Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin were both rising at the same time, playing the same concert circuits and chasing the same crown. When Blackmore heard this album, he knew immediately that the game had fundamentally changed. Jimmy Page had raised the stakes for everyone. Whole Lotta Lovin' opened with a riff that felt like an earthquake. The Lemon Song stomped through blues structures like a giant. Heartbreaker proved that Page could shred and solo with the absolute best guitarists in the world. These were traditional blues forms crushed under massive Marshall amplifier stacks. Raw power was mixed expertly with studio magic and experimentation. Page used the recording studio as another instrument in itself, adding echoes, effects, and sonic treatments that made everything bigger, stranger, and louder. Blackmore respected Page deeply as they competed directly. He reflected that Zeppelin pushed Deep Purple to be heavier, faster, and better overall. You couldn't afford to rest when another band was making records of that quality and power. The rivalry between the two bands became fuel for both of them. When Deep Purple recorded their landmark album Machine Head 2 years later, Zeppelin's shadow loomed large over the sessions. That competitive push and pull ultimately made both bands legendary. Led Zeppelin II wasn't just an album Blackmore loved and admired. It was the album that made him work harder than ever before.
The seventh and most important influence on Blackmore's development didn't come from rock music at all. It came from the 18th century and a German composer named Johann Sebastian Bach, specifically his Brandenburg concertos. These weren't rock and roll. They were mathematics disguised as music, filled with precision, counterpoint, and structure so perfect it felt like architecture rather than sound. For Ritchie Blackmore, these compositions were absolutely sacred. Blackmore had studied classical guitar extensively before he ever plugged into an electric amplifier. Bach taught him that genuine freedom only exists inside discipline. You could be creative within established rules, not despite them. Every single note in the Brandenburg concertos has a specific purpose. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is random or accidental. That philosophy shaped absolutely everything Blackmore would later create in rock music. When you listen to Highway Star by Deep Purple, that Baroque-style keyboard and guitar trade-off comes directly from Bach. When you hear Stargazer by Rainbow with its medieval grandeur and precise composition, that's Bach's influence too. Blackmore once stated that rock musicians who don't study classical music are essentially building houses without proper foundations. He absolutely meant it. While other guitarists worshiped blues legends and tried to copy their styles, Blackmore worshipped structure, harmony, and the old classical masters. The Brandenburg concertos weren't just his favorite classical work, they were his blueprint for everything he created. From Bach's harpsichord to Blackmore's Stratocaster, the line was direct and clear. Discipline enabled his darkness and his heavy sound. Structure freed his solos to explore while remaining coherent, and it all started here with Bach. Ritchie Blackmore never followed the crowd or tried to fit into existing categories. From Hendrix's Fire to Bach's Mathematical Ice, these 7 albums built the foundation for hard rock's greatest architect. Each one taught him something distinctly different. Break rules when necessary. Respect structure always. Take influences and make them completely your own. His legacy proved that the guitar could function as both a weapon and a symphony, capable of destruction and beauty simultaneously. These albums showed him the path, and he walked it with absolute conviction, creating a body of work that continues to influence guitarists decades later. His approach demonstrated that true innovation comes not from ignoring the past, but from studying it deeply and then transforming those lessons into something entirely new.